All right, here we go. So we're going to go through the Cold War, and we're going to hit a lot of different nations. We're going to carry the story of Europe, Africa, India, China, and just sort of try to take us through the Cold War in general, and a lot of stories and things that I'll hit you in between. But this is a global 2 review, so let's get going. So first, a good image of the Cold War. This division between communism in the East and capitalism in the West, what we would refer to, if we're going Winston Churchill references, the Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. And so, to understand the Cold War, you've got to understand the 2 ideologies, right? You've got to know communism, you've got to know capitalism. It would be helpful if you knew a couple of people associated with each. So on the left, you've got communism, and you should think of Karl Marx. You should think of the proletariat and the rising up to overthrow the bourgeoisie. You should think of the hammer and the sickle, the workers of the factories and the farm workers coming together to create a classless society, one where everyone is equal. Vladimir Lenin would be the leader of the Bolshevik Party who makes Karl Marx's dreams a reality, though not in the place Marx predicted. He thought that it would happen in an industrialized nation. It actually happened in a very agrarian situation. Animal Farm is a good example of how communism can have these ideals but not live up to them. On the other side, you should think of when you play Monopoly, you're trying to make the most money. That's what capitalism says, right? Capitalism is an idea that anyone can own their own business, that laissez-faire is the style of government that we should be aiming for, and Adam Smith puts out this idea in his book, The Wealth of Nations, the most boring man in history. Let's get going and talk about the Cold War. First, you got your ideologies. Communism in the East, democracy, capitalism in the West. The USSR influences the nations of the East and tells them to form the Warsaw Pact, a group of communist-based nations, though I would argue many of them did not want to be communist. On the other side is the Western nations who form NATO, and they form NATO and gain a lot of resources, including access to Marshall Plan funds to rebuild Western Europe, which had been destroyed as a consequence of World War II. Let's not forget that. So, here's your Soviet satellite states. You've got a bunch of different ones here, places like Ukraine, Poland, Kazakhstan, the bunch here. Now, Germany is a good example of how this thing plays out. It's like our case study, if you will. So, once Adolf Hitler is killed, takes his own life in the bunker, what happens next is a land grab, and the USSR takes East Berlin and all of Eastern Germany. And the United States and its allies, France and Great Britain, take the west of Germany. However, they divide the capital city of Berlin. So you've got a French sector, a British sector, and an American sector. So Berlin is the capital city. It's within the Eastern Bloc. So it's in Joseph Stalin's territory. But because it's the capital city, they decide to split it further because they want to complicate things, apparently. So Germany gets 4 zones. The Western powers begin to airlift supplies because Joseph Stalin will not allow them to travel into his zone. So we start to airlift supplies. It's called the Berlin Airlift. It lasts about 10 months, and it's very successful. So finally, the Soviets just agree to let our supplies come in, right along a road and make it easy. So this is the situation that you get, and I think this is a graphic that's really important for you to understand, where Berlin is further split within the east of Germany. So it's one of those like Russian Easter eggs of sorts, where you got, a zone within a zone, if you will. So there's the Berlin Airlift. We got our supplies to our West Berliners. Now, how does this all function? How does it all work? It comes down to foreign policy. So the United States follows a policy called containment. This will sort of make our actions known to the rest of the world. That is, that we do not want communism to spread to the world. We believe that if it does, it will cause a domino theory in which one nation falls to communism, they all will start to fall. And so we come up with the Truman Doctrine. Basically, we're going to buy our friends. We're going to give money to people who will stay capitalist. And the Marshall Plan would be a great example of that, where 13 billion is funneled into countries like Greece and Turkey, France and Britain, right? We are giving money to our buddies. So there's your domino theory political cartoon. If Laos falls, Vietnam will fall, so on and so forth. And we'll talk about these places in just a little bit. The arms race. This is a dash to build up military technology. I'm talking about nuclear weapons, though not exclusively. We could talk about planes, spy planes and things of that nature. It also comes down to, we decided that because we had so many nuclear weapons, we needed to talk about limiting them. And that's where MAD comes in, mutually assured destruction. The idea is we're not going to use nuclear weapons. Like, we agree we can't use them, because if we do, the world could end. It's a prediction that, we don't want to see come true. The space race is just, the U.S. and the USSR trying to one-up each other. So, like, they send someone to space, we send someone to the moon. Sounds pretty petty, and in some ways it kind of is. So there's your 1969 moon landing. Sputnik was the Soviets. We go to the moon with Buzz Aldrin, right? And Neil Armstrong. So there you go. You got the U.S. on the moon, and then there's a nice little meme for you. Hopefully you smile. Okay. Most important thing you got to understand. If I were writing an essay about the Cold War, I would explain this. This would be like my introduction, okay? And I would explain that the Cold War is a series of proxy wars where it operates like Rock'em Sock'em Robots. When you play this game, you're not actually fighting each other. You're using the robots to fight one another, right? Well, that's how this Cold War is fought. That's how the U.S. and USSR fought. They didn't upright go after each other. They didn't really shoot at each other directly. It wasn't an all-out war. It's what we call a Cold War. Instead, what they'd do is they'd arm a side in a civil war, tell them you have to follow our ideology, we'll give you all the weapons, ammunition, guns you need, and then they watch them fight out their civil war. If it sounds animalistic, if it sounds kind of sinister, that's because it is, because these are real people. So these proxy wars are wars where you choose a side, you arm a side, and you watch it play out, okay? There are strings attached. If you get aid from the USSR, you got to be communist. If you get aid from the United States, well, you got to be a democracy capitalism, okay? So, these Cold Wars, these proxy wars, are just wars where they're not directly involved, they're just arming the side and watching it all play out, okay? Critical definition. Know it, understand it, use it. Now, let's carry up our story of Joseph Stalin, the man who created the 5-year plans, the man who created collectivization in Ukraine, a failure upon a failure. He passes away in 1953. The doctors were so afraid of him that they didn't want to operate on him because they were worried that, if he somehow survived and wasn't quite right, that they'd blame him, whoever the doctor is. So really just a monster. Khrushchev takes over. Nikita Khrushchev takes over as the new leader of the USSR. And basically, he is trying to hold on while at the same time go through a process called de-Stalinization. Basically saying, like, Stalin made some really bad errors, and we need to fix those things. So I'm not going to tell you he's a smiley, cheery dude. He's not. But he's better than Joseph Stalin. During his time, he's going to start to build the Berlin Wall in 1963, and it'll be a while before that thing's going to be knocked down. So, here is Lenin's tomb, and Lenin is considered a hero, so they, hold on to his body, still have his body, they keep it preserved as best they can, whereas with Joseph Stalin, they just, put him under a tree and said, this is where Joseph Stalin was. So, let's talk about that Berlin Wall really quickly. It's a physical symbol of the division between democracy and communism. So you get the physical symbol, not the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is just a literal symbol. It's just this is something that we sort of see. But the Berlin Wall, you can actually touch it, feel it, right? It's tangible. So 1963 to 1989 is the Berlin Wall. And there you go. You got people doing the barbed wire because the communists need to create barbed wire to keep all of the other communists in. What an oxymoron that is. Okay. So, now that we've got the stages and early political theory behind us on the Cold War, let's look at the Cold War in a bunch of different places, okay? First place, Cold War in China. I'm going to take you right up to present day. Let's carry the story of what we've been talking about. So China had been engulfed in a civil war. After the revolution in 1911 with Sun Yat-sen, we know that Chiang Kaishek, not Shrek, took over and he creates a nationalist party. Well, we need to talk about somebody who was born under this movement, somebody who actually started out being a nationalist. And it starts in Hunan, a little province there. And the man's name was Mao Zedong. And Mao was born, his father was a grain merchant, so he had some wealth, and he believed that Mao needed a good education. So Mao goes ahead, gets a great education, and he is looking for a job as a teacher, can't find one, so he becomes a, get this, librarian. Okay, scary librarian position. And as a librarian, he starts to get into these books, and he starts reading. And one of the books he reads is about this guy named Vladimir Lenin, who talks about a communist revolution and how to do it. And he talks about the power of a communist revolution is not what Marx said. It's not in the industrialized sector. It's really in the agrarian society. It's with the peasants. It's with the farmers. If you can mobilize them, you can do anything you want. And Mao Zedong holds on to that steadfast, and he really believes in this Leninist idea of creating an agrarian society of communism. And Mao goes a step further. He's going to make this a whole lot worse. However, that's his roots. Now, to understand Mao Zedong, you need to know he ran with the nationalists for a while, until the nationalists started massacring their own people, until the nationalists started going after the communists. And Mao Zedong, reading that book and hearing what he heard about Lenin, he joined the Communist Party. Thing is he's a really good speaker. Thing is, he's able to galvanize attention, and in China, just know that teachers are given a higher place in society. So Mao Zedong was more respected amongst those fellows in the Communist Party. And he moves up the ranks, and pretty soon Chiang Kaishek goes after his group, the communists. So Mao Zedong takes his people through this really long march. And guess what they call it? They call it the Long March. It's a march through the South. It's a really long march that takes all of the South. And along the way, he's gathering followers. And he goes all the way into the mountains, through the desert, and comes back through. Powerful, strong, loved by the people. Well, here's what happens. After the Long March, a group comes knocking, a group that, comes from the nation that looks like a seahorse, and it comes down through, and this nation known as Japan does the things that we talked about in Nanking. And I won't recap those things. Check out my other video on World War II if you need to hear about the rape of Nanking. But here's, suffice it to say, brutality is inflicted upon the Chinese people. Chiang Kai-shek's losing control, so he eventually puts out his hand to Mao Zedong and says, "Will you help me kick out the Japanese?" And Mao says, "Sure, but once I win, you're out of the country." And they strike a deal, okay? Mao helps Chiang Kai-shek, not Shrek, and they defeat and push out the Japanese. Oh, by the way, 2 atomic bombs on their island would also push them out as well. And when that happens, Mao Zedong rises to power, and the great teacher turned librarian takes power in the Communist Party. What happens to Chiang Kai-shek? Great question. He ends up in Taiwan, where they are still there today. The Nationalist Party of China still exists, but it's in Taiwan. So now Mao Zedong, he's sort of happy, excited, he's ruling, he's got this communism, the party is under his control. So he says something. He's like, "Listen, I want criticism. Being a good teacher that I am, can you give me some criticism? How can I run the government more efficiently?" And people really took to this. They're like, wow, a government that cares about its people. So they start, delivering some criticism, writing about Mao Zedong. And the criticism is pretty harsh. He's not fixing the economy fast enough. He's not managing the economy very well. What is this guy doing? He's a joke. Mao loses it. He's like, I didn't want that much criticism. And so he turns on all those people that spoke out and just attacks them. He jails them, kills them, whatever he's got to do, but he goes after them. And it's called the 100 Flowers Campaign. He asks for criticism, then crushes those people that criticized him, okay? Just a moment where you see this like affinity for love. Like Mao is searching to be loved by the people. And when he doesn't get it, he becomes infuriated. So he's trying something else. He's like, I want to be loved by the people. I want to be loved. How do I do it? And so he tries something called the Great Leap Forward, which is awful. If I ever was going to teach you some math, this math does not add up. Take the 2 plans of Joseph Stalin that didn't work, okay? 5-year plans. Collectivization. Now, add them together. You know what you get? You get horrible, horrible famine. You get the Great Leap Forward. Essentially what the Great Leap Forward was taking rapid industrialization of the 5-year plans and then forced collectivization in the agricultural sector. Bringing those things together, doing them at the same time. It's going to create the worst man-made famine in history. 40 million people, more than the Taiping Rebellion. I mean, this is just nasty. So now the people are further angered at Mao Zedong. So he's like, what do I do? How do I get the people to love me again? People in his party are starting to turn against him. What do I do? And so he decides to do this. He goes around, he creates this little red book, massively puts it out there, and it's all of Mao's best sayings. He says, I want the youth to have a new revolution. I want a cultural revolution. I want more people to love communism and, by extension, love me. Well, how do you do that? Well, he gives out the books, and then he says, I want you to form what's called the Red Guard, which are young people who act as police. And I want you to arrest those who are counter-revolutionaries. I want you to arrest those who are capitalist-leaning people. I want you to go after the people who are against me. Your teachers, okay? People who have ever wronged you, right? He gives so much power to young kids. I'm talking 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids. I'm going to give you this power. I'm going to give you the ability to arrest other folk. What do you think's going to happen? This is like Lord of the Flies status. The people rise up. They have all this power. They start marching their teachers in the streets with dunce caps on, saying, you are evil. You are people who are trying to destroy the revolution because you gave me an F on my paper one time and I hate you for it still. Okay? Nasty stuff. It loses its grip out in the countryside. So like in the countryside, they start developing statues for Mao Zedong. But then they also start doing something else weird. They develop little spots in their house, like a little closet area, and they would make up like a little like statue, not even made of like metal or bronze or anything like that, but just like little handmade statues of Mao Zedong and little portraits of him in their like little closet. And then they go in there and they like pray to Mao, worship Mao, kind of like a demagogue in many ways. And so they're like praying to this Mao in this, weird culty kind of way. And then they start doing other things like having flesh feasts where they're like, eating the people who are counter-revolutionaries, which is really gross and really nasty. So spiraling out of control, to say the least. Mao Zedong here, pictured there, he's got his portraits hung everywhere. I mean, guys, this is about love. This is about trying to get the people to love him again. Okay? So, there's Mao. So, what is the Great Leap Forward? You should be able to tell me, number one, it's collectivization, it's 5-year plans at the same time. What could go wrong? 2, why do you think Mao launched a cultural revolution? Because he wanted to be loved again. He wanted to get back that love. And if he had to deputize all of the 14-year-olds in his nation, he would do it. So, that's what happens when you give police power to kids your age. Scary. I'm scared right now just thinking of it. Alright, Civil War in China. First, you have got the CCP, the communists, versus the nationalists, also known as the Kuomintang. Over there is Chiang Kaishek, not Shrek, and he is massacring the communists. So remember what happens next, the Long March, where Mao Zedong goes out there and makes his famous retreat. And in that retreat, he gets a lot of people to follow him. We're talking 100,000 soldiers marching over a year, going 8,000 miles. That's a lot. So he rises. Chiang Kai-shek asks for help to defeat the Japanese. Once they left, Mao takes his revenge and kicks out the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek goes to Taiwan. The nationalists still there today. That's why we have a one China policy, by the way, because there's really two Chinas. There's the nationalist China and the communist China. We just don't recognize the nationalist China. We don't even recognize them. It's like they don't really exist. We don't really want to trade with them. We want nothing to do with them. And if you think about economics, maybe you'll start to see why. Okay, Mao's Great Leap Forward. So he's going to do those two things, rapid industrialization and collectivization at the same time. 40 million people lose their lives over the course of 2 years. You read that stat again, that should give you a pause. That is insane. And there's many other things about that. You know, parents were like forced to like bury their children alive. I mean, it's just nasty punishments for you not going along with that plan. What a terrible, terrible time in China. So, to fix all that, he deputizes the 14-year-olds and the peasants, giving them the right to go after people in power. Sorry, I went a little fast. And Mao decides that he has finally reached that demigod status that he so wanted. So, what happens after Mao? Well, people cry at his funeral, even though he killed 40 million people over the course of 2 years with his policies. But they cry, and maybe it's part fear, maybe it's part propaganda. I don't know what it is, but I know this. We get the coolest name in global history. Deng Xiaoping. Go ahead and say it aloud. It's awesome. Deng Xiaoping is going to do something pretty radical. He is going to use the 4 modernizations to basically do this. Make an economic system of capitalism in China while keeping that communist dictatorship in power. So it's the dictatorship of communism mixed with the laissez-faire angle of capitalism, where you're trying to like just get the lowest prices you can and treat your workers with as little respect as you can. It's sort of like the worst of two systems going together at the same time. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but that's just the way things worked out. So it's economically speaking a capitalist country, but politically speaking, it's a communist authoritarian dictatorship, right? It's like absolute monarchy style, if you think about it that way. And here's the deal. The students that existed during Deng Xiaoping's reign didn't really understand it at first. They were like, wow, he's bringing capitalism. That must mean democracy. And he was like, nah, not quite, okay? The students began to protest, saying, Deng Xiaoping, we want democracy, we want help, yada, yada, yada. And they're really excited. We're like, we need democracy. And he brings in the tanks and says, absolutely not. So between 500 and 2,000 students are killed in this Tiananmen Square massacre. And it really amounts to showing us that it's a capitalist economy with an authoritarian dictatorship at the top, okay? And why is that spread 500 to 2,000? Because China's got so much propaganda out there and holds onto the records so much and hides stuff that we really don't know. It's not like they broadcast these results. I think in their records, it's like single digits. It's like, 5 kids and it was like an accident or something. So the numbers are skewed, and it's because they're holding onto the records and not letting us know, okay? Here's a famous moment in the Cold War. Tank Man is seen there. Yes, say hi to Tank Man, okay? Tank Man standing up to these Chinese tanks coming right at him. Someone, rushes and grabs him and gets him out of the way. But point is that the people tried to protest against this regime, and it didn't work out too well. Okay, so China done. Leaving China, let's go to Korea. And let's talk about what the Cold War looked like in Korea. That's what it looked like in China. Let's look at it. How does it end up in Korea? And to do that, we've got to do a couple things on a map and get you ready for any map quiz that your teacher may or may not give you. Okay. So you got your North, Kim Il-sung. He is a communist. He's going to get support from both the USSR and the Chinese government. And just know that in the South, he may look like a nice old grandpa. He is not. He is the meanest, evilest grandpa around on the block, okay? But his first name is Sigmund, and there's an S for Sigmund, and there's an S for South. That makes it awesome for a map quiz. And we're looking at the domino theory. Oh my gosh, let's not let Korea fall, because if they fall, what happens to other nations like Japan? They could fall too. So we're going to have to do some pretty unique stuff to try to make sure that we I guess, liberate the South Koreans. So we got to look at this map, and we got to understand it, and we got to break it down. So Kim Il-sung is going to take his soldiers, and he's going to move them past the 38 parallel, and he's going to invade, and push the South Korean forces far south into this area. And of course, understanding that right around, I'm just going to use a little green color here, right around this little green color here, I'm going to put it here, is Seoul. And so, he's able to take the capital city, and he pushes the forces into this little area, and they'll be pushed in this area known as Pusan. It's called the Pusan Perimeter. And so, with the forces pushed in, the Americans are going to hear about communism spreading and domino theory and all of that kind of stuff, and so they get really afraid, and they send in Douglas MacArthur from Japan, who had been ruling it like a military dictatorship, and he puts his forces here, and he looks at the present situation and says, well, I'm not going to be able to invade head-on, but I have an idea, and so he's going to take his forces, and he's going to go around this area here. He's going to go through Incheon, and he's going to call it Operation Chromite. And he cuts the supply forces. He flanks and outflanks the North Korean army. And so now he's able to take back Seoul. But of course he doesn't want to stop there, and so he continues to push, and he pushes up to the north, taking over and pushing up until he gets to this river here called the Yalu River. It's like his natural border, and he notices that there are a bunch of evil librarian Mao Zedong forces here, and they are helping, and they are going to provide aid to the North Koreans. So he calls up Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States, and says, I am going to bomb all of China and North Korea. Not may I, not can I, not would you think it would be good if we used the atomic bomb? He says, no, I'm going to bomb all of China and all of North Korea. I'm going to use the atomic bomb. At that moment, everything changes. And so what happens is MacArthur, being pushed back a little bit, is going to be taken out of the conflict entirely. And what do you think happens when the best general leaves? Well, of course, Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans get pushed back into the DMZ, and the South Koreans, led by evil Grandpa Syngman Rhee, are going to be pushed to the DMZ, and the forces decide to sign an armistice. An armistice is a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, so they are technically still at war to this very day, but the bullets stop flying, and you get the situation where Korea is a divided nation. It continues to be a divided nation, two separate flags, two very distinctly different flags, and the people of the North are ruled by Kim Jong-un today, and the Kim family. Okay, so that's the situation we are at. So please be able to label this map correctly, and also be able to draw the route known as Operation Chromite. C-H-R-O-M-I-T-E. Okay. So, that's what the situation looks like today, where they're both staring at one another, in this big stare down this Wild West sort of feel. Now today, here's the the Kim family line, and you've got Kim Jong-un still in power right now. A 2018 update is that the two sides have reached some sort of cooling off of tensions, if you will. They met, they talked, they smiled, they discussed. They still don't have peace, but we're hopeful. Other places you should know about would be Cuba. Cuba was a communist overthrow of Batista, who was a militarist primarily, and Fidel Castro creates a communist regime. Nikita Khrushchev helps him in this endeavor, giving him weapons, supplies, and ammunition. And Fidel Castro survives something called the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the CIA trained up a group, the United States CIA trained up a group of Cuban exiles, and sent them at the Cubans. The invasion was a total failure, but the idea was that we were trying to take back and bring capitalism back to Cuba, but the Cuban people fought hard and kept communism in their state, or in their nation. Now, how far is Cuba from Florida? You should know that it's 90 miles away. So this is really scary when you have missile silos 90 miles away, and they happen to be nuclear missiles, which creates the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President John F. Kennedy realizes that through the U-2 spy plane that there are some nuclear missiles on Cuba pointed at the United States. So the U.S. begins quarantining, basically a trade embargo, just weaker language, and the USSR is going to strike a deal. Basically, they say, listen, we'll take the missiles up. Only thing is, you must allow Cuba to remain communist and take your missiles away from Turkey, which is kind of interesting. So we had already had missiles pointed at the USSR. They had missiles pointed at us, at Cuba, and the world was afraid that it would end. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest we come to nuclear war. Just know that we did have missiles on Turkey and that it could have been really, really bad. It's a clear example of the arms race in action. So this political cartoon sort of shows that, with JFK, ready to pull the trigger or push the button, if you will, and Khrushchev being even closer, perhaps showing how close Cuba is to America. You've got hydrogen bombs now, which are way more destructive than atomic bombs, if there was ever such a way to do that. And so this is a clear example of the Cold War in action. You should know something about Vietnam as well. So we'll do a little bit on Vietnam. Why Vietnam probably never should have happened. Why this wall should have never been there. And it starts with the idea that Vietnam was ruled by France. It was called Indochina. Okay, so way before it was Vietnam, it was called Indochina. And French Indochina was run through imperialist means. So that means that a stronger nation takes over a weaker nation for economic or military gain. In this case, a lot of economic gain, where they are taking all the raw materials away from French Indochina, which now you know is Vietnam, and they live in luxury. So the Vietnamese make the rice in the fields and live a tough life. Meanwhile, the French live in villas and enjoy a not so tough life. So a young man by the name of Ho Chi Minh realizes that this is wrong, and he decides to go to the Treaty of Versailles in France. He's getting his education there, and he hears about this wonderful moment. There's Ho Chi Minh later in his life, but early in his life, he hears about a president named Woodrow Wilson who is arguing for self-determination. The idea that every person and every a group of people have the right to their own nation, if only they vote and do it democratically. So Ho Chi Minh wants to talk to Woodrow Wilson and say, listen, can you help us have a democratic society? Can you help us kick out these imperialist people and create a nation for the Vietnamese? Well, Woodrow Wilson says he doesn't have time for that. He's like, Ho Chi who? No, I don't have time for that. And, part of that probably too is that France was our ally, and so we really didn't want to get involved in that. But Woodrow Wilson had the opportunity to help Ho Chi Minh, and perhaps if he had, maybe this could have been an entirely different story, but instead he does not. He tells Ho Chi Minh he cannot help them. And so what happens next? Ho Chi Minh, realizing that, he needs his strong nation and wants to have it, he goes to the USSR, basically the only other game in town. And the USSR says, sure, buddy, I'll help you out. I'll give you weapons, supplies, and military training. All you got to do is be communist. And so he takes the deal on the table because it's the only deal. And he trains up the Viet Cong, who are also known as Charlie, whom I often say they were everywhere, but they were nowhere through their tunneling. And the Americans will fight back with eventually getting into this conflict and using awful things like Agent Orange, and they will use napalm strikes, and it's just going to get really, really, really bad. Well, in the South, they have a ruler by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. So in the North, they have Ho Chi Minh, who's supplied by the USSR, and Ngo Dinh Diem is really cruel to his own people, in particular the Buddhists. He goes after the Buddhists, so the Buddhists protest by lighting themselves on fire. And so what happens is the Vietnamese people, first, they kick out the French. This is during World War II, so the French really have to pull out because they are invaded by Germany, right? Nazi Germany. So he feels like it's a victory until the Japanese come in. So then he's got to kick out the Japanese. Oh my gosh, you know how brutal they are. So he kicks out the Japanese. Well, the French then try to come back and take back their old homeland of, or colony of sorts. And so the Ho Chi Minh forces have to fight France again. So it goes France, Japan, France, and then what happens next is going to be America. And the Americans begin to bring their ships into this area here called the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin. And the reports are that the USS Maddox, a big ship out there, USS Maddox, received some fire from a few rifled Viet Cong, the Charlie, the VC, the guerrilla fighters, And so we decide that that was provocation. You're firing on our American ships, with your rifles, and that's not right. So we need to preserve democracy and, prevent these communist rabble-rousers from, spreading into South Vietnam and taking over everything. And so we get involved, along this, 17th parallel here. We get involved and we decide that we want to unite South Vietnam with North Vietnam, and we want to take out the communists and get rid of that. So the United States come in, and it's a brutal war because the Viet Cong are everywhere and nowhere. They often are going to use, trails called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they're going to go through other nations, like Laos, like Cambodia, and they're going to come through and they're going to make it really hard for us because, they're not even in their own nation in some ways. They are traveling through other nations. They are in plain clothes, so they don't have like that, regular army feel. This is just, they're farmers by day and then guerrilla fighters at night. They're also using tunneling systems, so we would take a hill, and then we would keep moving, and then they would use those tunnels, and they take the hill right behind us, and it was just like this constant back and forth. There were awful events like the My Lai massacre, where our soldiers just lost it, who's bad and who's good, and just lost our morality in some ways. So, in the end, what we will do is, on a famous holiday called Tet, we will stop fighting, and we believe that we are helping to celebrate their Vietnam New Year's of sort. And what happens is Ho Chi Minh uses this opportunity to hit in all these little places here, and hits in these coordinated strikes. And this is the Tet Offensive. And at this holiday of Tet, our soldiers are, I don't want to say defeated, but certainly hurt by all of these, coordinated strikes all at once. And so America loses its ground that it had taken, and from this point on, after the holiday known as Tet, we are be able to label the 17th and make sure that you can separate these. And know that after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, we get involved, and it's after the Tet Offensive that there's a turning point and we begin to lose. South Vietnam eventually is taken by the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh and becomes one nation, a communist nation. Okay? So, let's go to the Cold War in India. Let's talk about India. So, to understand India, you need to know that it's got a legacy of imperialism where the Indian people were taken over after the Sepoy Mutiny, where there was a rumor that the guns were being greased with cow fat and pork fat, cow being sacred to the Hindus, pork being something that Muslims do not eat. And so it made the Sepoys very angry. The Sepoys are soldiers of India who were being bought and paid for by the British, and they rose up, and the British put them down and used this as an opportunity to say that India is now their colony, and they will grow the poppy flower to make opium to ship to China and force feed it to the Chinese. And this occupation is a brutal one. I mean, the Amritsar massacre, where the soldiers just fire upon unarmed crowds, it's nasty, brutal stuff, right? This is what imperialism can do. So how does it end? It ends with a guy who was a former lawyer in Mohandas Gandhi, who will later take the name Mahatma Gandhi. But Mohandas Gandhi, or Gandhi as we call him, is able to read about civil disobedience. And it's the idea that you intentionally break a law that you feel is unjust to get change. And he comes back, joins the Indian National Congress, and fights for political change. And the way that he does it is through his philosophy of civil disobedience. He does this, it's very rooted in his Hindu beliefs of ahimsa, which is nonviolence. He calls it passive resistance. And, not passive in the sense I'm not trying, but passive in the sense that he does not believe in using violence. Okay? So some examples, some boycotts, right? He says, we're going to spin our own clothes. We're not going to buy from the British. He says we're going to go through a salt march, which is basically we're going to march to the sea. We're going to take the salt from the Indian Ocean. It's our salt, and we're purposely disobeying the law that says that the British have a monopoly on salt. And it brings attention to the world and says, listen, British imperialism is wrong. And it leads to the British leaving and a split where India is split between India and Pakistan. The Muslims live in Pakistan, and the Hindus keep the majority India. This makes the Muslims very angry. And, Gandhi was a nationalist leader, so he really believed that India should stay together and that Muslims and Hindus should live together. Well, Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu extremist. He's assassinated by his own people because they believe he's too soft. He's just not hard enough on the Muslims. And so this division is still alive today. And the big problem, in addition to it just, not being, very good to be a divided people, well, there's Nehru, who supports democracy and is supported by, more of the capitalist, wing. Pakistan, more of the Muslim sector. So the Muslims live in Pakistan and the Hindus live in India. They hate one another and both have nuclear weapons. That's the scary part of this whole thing. India is part of the non-alignment movement, so they don't really take a side in the Cold War, but they do have nuclear weapons, both sides, and they're armed to the teeth. So, let's talk about human rights violations in the Cold War and give you a little story. So, we've got to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, and the way that I always start with Eleanor is just talking to you about her story, because she's an amazing woman, and she does what no other woman was able to do during her time period, which is to really dominate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and get a document that will be the thing that the United Nations uses to determine whether or not human rights violations are occurring. And in that way, she creates the aims, she creates the goals, and she creates the aspirations that we as a human race are trying to attain. And her story starts with a family portrait here of young Eleanor. And I think her father loved her, but her mother was, I don't know, a more fickle woman. She was quite mean to Eleanor. She even bullied her. It was said that when Eleanor was a child, she would dance around like little kids do, but she never smiled. And it was because her mother called her Granny. She said her child looked like a little granny and was very ugly. And so Eleanor, at a young age, had to learn that when she was useful, her mother loved her. That to be loved, you must be useful. And so she had to find a way to become useful. Her mother suffered from these awful migraines, and so she would come in and, massage her mother's temples, and in those moments she said her mother showed her a little sign of affection. And so Eleanor Roosevelt grew up, and her mother eventually passes away from diphtheria. Her father, instead of comforting the children, actually starts to drink more, and so eventually Elliot is not around to be able to take care of the children, and pretty soon he is taken away by alcoholism. And so Eleanor is given away to her grandparents, and she's hoping her grandparents will give her something, some measure of love or something like that, and they don't. Instead, they send her away to a boarding school in France, and that might have been the best thing that ever happened to Eleanor, because she met a teacher, and Madame Sylvester, who really stepped up and took care of her and showed her the meaning of giving back to others, what we call service learning. And so Madame Sylvester and Eleanor Roosevelt would walk the streets of France, and she learned to give back to others, working at a soup kitchen, things like that. And Eleanor really learned her morals, and she learned that to give back is not to write a check the way that maybe a Roosevelt had done in the past. She came from a wealthy family, but that didn't matter. What matters is giving to others. And so it's Eleanor Roosevelt during the Great Depression. She's like out there, the soup kitchen. She's going to places, figuring out what do people need. And that type of service is what she carried on when she grew older and when she worked in the United Nations. And she may not have had a marriage of love with Franklin. It may not have been one of love, but I can tell you this: it was a powerful marriage. It gave her a voice. It gave her an opportunity to change the world, and so she did with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sort of makes the ideas of John Locke and the Enlightenment come alive. That we are born with certain rights, and these rights are given to us. We do not have to fight for them or earn them. They are ours to have, and that the United Nations must police them and make sure that people are guaranteed these rights no matter what nation they come from. So what I'm going to do is show you a couple examples where we still failed to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's not to say that it was a total failure, no, but to say that we have some room for growth following the Holocaust. It's not like the world was fixed forever. There are some problems and some real ugliness going on. So we start with Cambodia. And we start with the regime known as the Khmer Rouge that was run by a guy named Pol Pot, who tried to go at the intellectuals. He went at the people who were quote-unquote smart, and he said that anyone who wore glasses was smart, and therefore they needed to be destroyed. And so he leads a brutal rebellion and a brutal communist dictatorship where he would put people in what are called killing fields and just massacred people, and creates a regime of evil and terror. And it's actually the Vietnamese that have to come in and crush the Khmer Rouge because of their brutality. So he also takes a page out of the Mao Zedong book by getting the young kids to do a lot of these killings and do a lot of this policing for him. He empowers the youth and gets them to do his bidding. Another example would be in Rwanda, pictured here. They used to be run by the Belgians, but by 1990, the Belgians are forced to leave because the whole of the world says imperialism is something that we did in the 1800s. We should stop doing it and should stop being involved in it in the 1900s. And there are two groups in Rwanda, the Hutus, who are more dark, and the Tutsis, who are more light. The Hutus are about 84% of the population and are disenfranchised. They're mostly poor. They do not get the rights that the Tutsis do. The Tutsis are lighter skinned, make up about 15% of the population. This is not by accident. This is what imperialists do. They use race to divide a nation and then use those races and pit them against one another. And the Belgians were masters at doing this. And so the Belgians, who are about 1% of the population, run Rwanda, take most of their wealth away, and then they just leave. And when they do, the Hutus rise up and attack the Tutsis and blame the Tutsis as collaborators and try to destroy them and wipe out their population. And it becomes a genocide in which nearly 1 million people die over the course of 100 days. The United Nations gets out all the Europeans, but really does nothing else. It does not really help the Tutsis a whole lot. And if you're interested in learning more about this, watch the movie Hotel Rwanda, and you'll see this horrible human rights violation in reality. Okay? The next one would be in Yugoslavia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That makes up the nations of Yugoslavia. Basically, what they did after World War II is they threw all these nations like Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia. They threw them all together and called it Yugoslavia. And it was occupied by the USSR, so it had communist leanings. And then when the USSR finally broke, which we'll talk about later in the lecture, what happens to all these states is they all want their independence, and they're all sort of, against one another in some ways, and there's ethnic divisions, and instead of settling it democratically, what happens is Serbia launches an invasion and tries to destroy the other nations and take it for themselves, and it comes down to like land requirements and whose land was what. And so the Serbs are led by Slobodan Milosevic, who wants to expand Serbia, and he uses ethnic cleansing. He tries to destroy the Bosnians and Croatians, and it's this nasty stuff. The United Nations and the United States come in. They arrest Slobodan Milosevic, and he dies awaiting his trial. So why am I telling you this stuff? Because we tried and we put together these aims, but there are 3 places that you should know about: Cambodia, Rwanda, and Yugoslavia, which are examples where we fell short in these high aims. Now let's go to the Cold War in South Africa, and we'll talk about a sad but then maybe happy ending in South Africa. And to start with South Africa, you should know about Nelson Mandela, pictured on the right there. And a little background, because you do know this, but just recapping. Apartheid is a system created by these people called the Boers, the Boring Boers, that you remember going way back, who were defeated by the British, but came back later and controlled this area and created a system called apartheid, which means to literally separate. And they were masters at pitting the races against one another, black and white and Indian and black, and just creating all these different racial connotations. The whites made up a very small percent of the population, but again destroyed and kept separate these races and used disenfranchising laws so that they could not vote. And then if you can't vote, you can't change laws, and therefore you can't really have the political discussions that are needed to dismantle a system like this. And the whites control all the wealth, and they created systems where the blacks had to live in certain areas, and they were policed by the military. It was a very nasty place to sort of be born under. And apartheid is just, reading all of this stuff, it just makes you sad. It's like the Jim Crow South of America, where there's certain jobs you can't have. There's you can't vote, you can't own land. There are just areas, like ghettos where you have to be. Those are your places, and you can't live anywhere else. You can't marry outside your race, and there's a whole laundry list of different races. You have to have identification cards on you at all times for your race. A very, very complicated system, but the point was to keep Africans under the control of the few whites. Well, just like with Gandhi, there was a struggle for equality, and it starts with the African National Congress. So if Gandhi had the Indian National Congress, the Africans take that model and call it the African National Congress. And they use civil disobedience, like Mohandas Gandhi, and so they are purposefully disobeying laws that they feel are unfair in order to get change. They are doing marches and boycotts and strikes. They're doing the whole 9. They face massacre, just like at Amritsar in India. You have the Sharpsville massacre, where this is a moment under apartheid where the government uses violence to combat peaceful protest. And it's going to make some people, including Nelson Mandela, go a little bit more radical. Mandela is going to actually start to be involved in some bombings of some military installments, and so he will do that, and he will be put on trial as a result. He is sentenced to life in prison for being involved in such violence, and he is beaten, he is tortured, both physically and of course mentally. They will take his letters and cut up the words so he can't read them, and this is his only way of contacting his children. Very, very brutal. And so, the rest of the world looks on, and eventually they say this thing called apartheid needs to come to an end. The United Nations condemns the system. Other nations refuse to trade with them. We call those economic sanctions, where you're not going to trade with somebody until they fix a policy that you disagree with. And with all this foreign pressure, Mandela is eventually freed from prison, and they agree to hold elections. And the elections are going to be every race, and so the whites and the blacks are going to go and figure out who's going to be president of South Africa. And of course, Nelson Mandela is elected in a landslide, and it wasn't even close. And so he takes over, and de Klerk, the white president of the past, is gone, and there's a lot of change. Apartheid is dismantled bit by bit as Mandela uses the legal system to his advantage. He is the first black president of South Africa, and while his story is a happy one, okay, the rest of Africa has some problems. And I'm not saying every other nation, but there are a lot of them who have had this history of imperialism. And here's what happens. When one imperialist nation leaves, often a power vacuum is created where dictators come in. And that's the situation that we have to face in Africa, even to this very day, as people like Robert Mugabe are in power, and they just sort of fill the imperialist power vacuum. And it's not necessarily the whites now who have all of the power. It's just a few of the blacks who have taken over and have a military. Those people stay in power. So it's just like a switch of roles, but nothing changes for the average person. And that's the problem that we face. So let's talk about the end of the Cold War and how that becomes, and how this sort of is fostered. So you need to know about détente, or some people say détente, but détente is a easing of the Cold War tension. A lot of President Nixon is going to help with that, and also Gorbachev is going to do that. And Mikhail Gorbachev is a leader of the USSR who brings perestroika, which is capitalism, to the USSR, and glasnost, which is openness of the press. Perestroika is capitalism, glasnost is openness of the press, and those two things create a USSR that is going to eventually become Russia. So some examples of the easing of the tension. SALT would be a good example, where they limit nuclear proliferation. That is, you can only have a certain amount of nukes. And Gorbachev's ideas, are if we have less, then we're less likely to use them, which I think is good. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost reforms are things that you should know for the regions. And again, it's capitalism for perestroika, and glasnost is the openness of the press. Okay? And the USSR ended financial help to other communist nations, essentially saying, listen, you can pursue your own type of political and economic philosophies, just, that's up to you, but we're no longer going to help you. And part of that is because the USSR is going bankrupt with this command economy system and all the proxy wars, and it's just becoming difficult to keep up with the United States. So eventually it falls, and all of those little satellite states are going to have their own elections and have their own differences. The USSR goes through a coup where the KGB tries to take back power, and a president by the name of Boris Yeltsin is able to defeat the KGB coup. But hold on to that thought as we go on a little bit. So when the USSR is no longer, it becomes Russia, led by President Boris Yeltsin. Now, what are some effects of this presidency of Boris Yeltsin and the Russians? Well, Russia, the USSR, no longer that superpower, okay? They no longer have that Iron Curtain that is descended, and there's some economic problems, some revolts that are going to occur, but the point is that I'll be talking about them as Russia from here on out in this lecture. And some other things that happened when the Russians, sort of took back their nation, or at least became Russia on the map now. Lech Walesa of Poland is going to take back his nation. He leads a movement called Solidarity, and he basically kicks out the communists and creates what he believes is a democratic government to really take back Poland from the satellite state that it was. Other important events would be Ayatollah Khomeini, who led a revolution in Iran. It's an Islamic fundamentalist state. That means Sharia law. That means you have to be a Muslim and a very rigid ideology. So Ayatollah Khomeini is going to take back his, nation. He kicks out anybody who is a foreigner. He does not want America involved, and we'll talk about why that is later in the lecture. There's Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin, the reason why I said I wanted to come back to the KGB losing the coup is because technically they did, but Vladimir Putin is an ex-KGB soldier. So to say that they lost the coup, well, they temporarily lost it, but now Vladimir Putin's in, and if you've ever seen a Vladimir Putin election, well, he makes sure that he wins. He fixes all of his elections so that he wins in mass numbers and makes it look really, really good, and then rules with this autocratic regime. So understanding that the KGB coup, continues, and you're just in a different kind of way, more of a shadowy kind of way. Probably the most complicated thing I'll teach you all year is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it is complicated, and if you need to hear it again, pause it here and rewind. But the Arab-Israeli conflict is very, very tricky to understand, because the thing about the place that is Israel there, okay, that area of Israel, three different groups have called it their land, and they've even called it different names. So the Jewish people, under Abraham and Moses, right, going back to those times, believed that that land was known as Canaan, that Yahweh had given it to them, and that their God had given them Canaan. So first, the Jewish people lay claim to this, and it's also the place where they created their first kingdom, the Kingdom of Israel. That's where it gets its name. The Christians believe that Israel is theirs, or at least they did, because of Jerusalem, and where that's located is the place where Jesus was crucified, Jesus of Nazareth, right, and where Nazareth is in the north. So for the Christians, this was a holy place for them. And then last but not least, the Muslims, they believe that this was their holy land, because this is the same place in Jerusalem where the Dome of the Rock is, and where Muhammad sort of rose up and went with Allah. He saw heaven and he saw hell with Archangel Gabriel, and did the whole divine intervention of sorts, and came back down and believed that he should spread Islam. And so for all of these reasons, each of these three major religious groups believed that this land was theirs. Well, the way that it worked was eventually the Ottoman Empire settled this land, the Middle East Empire, and the people who lived in this land did not call it Israel anymore, because the Jewish people had been pushed away, what's called the diaspora, kicked out of their own lands, and the Palestinians believed that this was their land. And from like the 1500s on, talking hundreds of years, 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, and even into the 1900s, they believed it was theirs. And so for all of those years, the Palestinians called it Palestine and called it theirs, until the British get involved. And the British believed in this movement. It was called Zionism, or at least a few did, and a guy by the name of Balfour, and they believed that the Jewish people needed their own land. And the reason for that is, think back to 1905, think back to the pogroms of Russia, right? The brutal nature with which the Jewish people were exposed to in the Pale, those brutal mass killings, and many of them migrated to America, and when they came to America, they faced even more anti-Semitism, more hatred, and so Balfour started to say, the Jewish people, they need their own homeland, and Theodor Herzl had led this movement, through his books, and talking about Zionism and giving the Jewish people back their homeland. So the British will, in the Balfour Declaration, say that we pledge to give the Jewish people back their homeland of Israel. And at the time, the British are involved in this thing called World War I, and they believed that once the Ottoman Empire was defeated, along with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, once the Central Powers are defeated, that they would give the Jewish people their home. Well, as the war raged on, they also had promised those same Palestinians that if they revolted against the Ottoman Empire and made it easy on that side and on that front, that they would give them their land. So they essentially promised the same piece of land to two different groups of people, one in the Jewish people, one in the Palestinian people. What could go wrong? And so it went wrong. And at the end of World War II, after the Holocaust, the world said, well, the British were right. We need to give the Jewish people their homeland. We need to protect them. And you can understand why after a human rights violation like that. The only problem is that the Palestinians feel like, well, you can't give my land to them. If you feel so, strong on Zionism, why don't you give away your land? But you can't give away my land. And so the situation was that the United Nations came in and said, Palestine, you must give up your land for the Jewish people. This is their land. This is their homeland. And the Palestinians said, no, we don't want to. And so it was this conflict called the Arab-Israeli War, and there were many of them. This is just one of many, and the two sides bombed each other, and the two sides continued to bomb each other because of promises made way back when, which said that both sides could have the land. And because of the holy traditions of these lands, it is really hotly contested. So the Israelis, the Jewish people, take Israel, and they hold on to it to this very day. And there are other problems, including the Suez Canal, where Egypt basically tries to thwart the Israelis who need the Suez Canal to trade, and they support their Muslim brothers, the Palestinians, and so they say they're going to nationalize the Suez Canal. Essentially, they're going to take the canal. It's theirs now, and they're only going to let the Palestinians trade in it, which would really hurt the Israelis. So the Israelis call their buddies, they're like, France, Britain, help me, and they do, and it creates this real big conflict over the Suez Canal, like who's going to get the canal. Well, the Americans come in, led by peanut farmer Jimmy Carter, and he decides that he is going to broker a peace deal through the Camp David Accords, and the Egyptians and the Israelis agree to share the canal. So they learn the lessons of kindergarten. I'm sorry, it's very much more complicated than that, but you need to smile at least once in this lecture. Okay? And so, what does the system look like today? Well, the system looks like terrorism. It's rough. It's horrible. It's back and forth. It's bombings on both sides. It's killing. It's anger. It's racism. It's a lot of different things all at once. And the Gaza Strip is probably one of the more brutal places in all of the world in terms of violence. A lot of terrorism back and forth. And today, the United States has given its support to Israel. At least we give them more money. So Benjamin Netanyahu is the leader of Israel that we support today. A very controversial leader. And essentially what you need to understand is that the land that once was Canaan is now Israel. The land that was once promised to the Palestinians is now given to the Israelis, and that land has been promised to two different groups of people, and that's why it's such a hotly contested debate, even to this very day. So listen to that one again, because it's very complicated, and you need to understand it to have a really good idea of how the world works today. So in the spirit of talking about modern day issues, here we go. We're going to talk about every nation that we have talked about, just like kind of catch them up to what are some problems that are going on today. And to understand that, you need to look at this map and be a little woke to what's going on here. So number one, a huge global problem would be terrorism and the rise of terrorism, which is people who use violence to achieve their goals. And this is not just a United States problem. This is a French problem. This is a English problem. This is a Russian problem. This is an everyone problem. That terrorism is on the rise globally. In addition, you should look at those countries that are in red and know that those are countries who have access to nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation is a problem. The one that I would be most worried about is North Korea over there, because the North Koreans are led by Kim Jong-un, and his mental fitness and his temperament have been in question. Other things that we should worry about would be pandemics. Not just talking about AIDS and HIV, but like things like swine flu or Ebola. Those are things that in this world where global trade has increased, pandemics are always a problem and things that we should be concerned about. And that's where science needs to match with these pandemics to prevent them. Globalization is where these multinational corporations have used developing nations who are struggling, nations who have experienced imperialism, and they use those people who have little political rights and little economic power, and they make them work for these global national corporations. Not only does that, just sustain them because they can just pay them really cheap, but it also hurts more developed nations, more strong nations with workers who have unionized, let's say America or France, because those nations, now have to compete with nations who can pay their workers a very low wage, and it depresses the workers in those other countries. So globalization, there's some positives, and there are also some negatives. A positive being that these nations have access to and the ability to make some more money for themselves and can provide different goods, and you get a lot of cultural diffusion in that way, but there is also some negative drawbacks in terms of workers' rights and being exploited and all of that kind of thing. There's an environmental crisis that you should be aware of. It's called global warming, and if you have not heard, you need to go to biology class, okay? I know you've heard of this, and this crisis of desertification and deforestation and the rise of greenhouse gases is a problem not just for the United States, but for everybody, and will take a global solution to combat it. So we're going to go continent and country by country and just kind of talk about where are these countries that I've spent so much time talking to you about, where are they today? And so to start with, you should know what the European Union is. The European Union is essentially a group of European nations that have come together and said we're going to use one currency, we call it the euro, pictured there, and we're going to have one agricultural policy to make sure everyone can eat, and we're going to have certain trade policies in effect and certain restrictions and regulations, and we're all going to agree to these policies for the betterment of Europe. Now, that sounds good on its face, but sometimes certain nations don't like all of the restrictions because all of those restrictions are based on compromise, and so you have to give a little, right? And some people don't really like to do that. And so Great Britain has decided to leave the European Union. It's famously called Brexit. They are deciding that, due to the regulations and the costs of being in the European Union, it's just not worth it to them anymore. And so by a narrow vote, they decided to leave the European Union. And we are speculating what's going to happen next. Will the Europeans stay together? Will they eventually collapse without Britain's economy? We're not too sure, but we know that there are going to be some changes going on in Europe. Here's a good example of nations changing. When we look at Germany, Germany's headed by Angela Merkel, who is a woman who believes in the multi-party system. It's something that the Germans have created. It's a very European understanding. So if in America you're pretty much going to be a Democrat or a Republican, and I know there are some independent parties, but they're not really well recognized. Okay, in Germany or in Europe in general, they have a multi-party system where you don't have to be just sort of one party or the other. You can be a mixture and a blend, and so you get a little bit more diversity in that way. So let's say you're not quite conservative, okay, but you're not quite liberal. You're somewhere in the middle, or you're somewhere further to the left, but not quite all the way over. You can find a party for you. If your party is more religious, and you value those things, you can join a party that's a little bit more religious, but still on the left. Okay, and so you get these really unique blends, and I think that that's a multi-party system. There's some real value to it in some ways. France, a place that I was last year in 2018. France is headed by Emmanuel Macron, and Macron is somebody who has really stepped up in terms of France as a national leader. He's getting more involved in national talks and things. And he has been criticized, however, because Macron has believed that the unions have, while they have their place, they have sort of taken maybe too much power and have run the country's debt too high, and so he has tried to fight against the unionization in some ways and fight against certain outdated transportation systems in France. He also believes in being a leader in the global stage in terms of greenhouse gases and eliminating them, and so he decided to raise the prices of petrol, gasoline in his country, very, very high, to make people want to carpool more and make people want to use their cars less. And this has been really, really a tenuous situation, because the people are starting to march in their yellow vests, something that all French people have to have in their car as a safety precaution. And they wear these vests because they believe that their government has overstepped their powers and their authority and are forcing people to pay things that they just simply cannot pay. And so there's been some riots and some real nastiness, tear gas being involved and all that kind of stuff. So France is got some tenuous situations and problems, and it has to do with environmental factors and government influence in their economy. Other things you should know about, I've talked about them, but just know that in Poland they have a democratic movement called Solidarity, pictured there, with Lech Walesa, and basically the goal of Poland was to kick out the communists and put in the democracy-loving people and bring democracy to Poland. Let's move to the Middle East, and what you see there is known as the Arab Spring. All these moments where the people of the Middle East tried to create a democratic government, and to varying degrees, some failed and some somewhat successful, mostly a youthful movement where the Middle East was trying to go towards democracy. Saudi Arabia, that would be a failure, right? The princes are still in power, and there's still a strong power structure, and people are still oppressed. But then in places like Egypt, they still were able to get some reforms. So it's a tricky situation where some got reforms and some didn't. But it's this moment where when one nation started, the other nations began to follow, and social media had a huge role in this, and inspiring other young people to rise up as part of the Arab Spring. You should also know in the Middle East a buzzword, OPEC. OPEC may be dying. I'm not sure, but I've heard that OPEC could be leaving. But for right now, it's not. So OPEC is an organization that functions kind of like a trust. The idea is that some countries, mostly Middle Eastern, but Venezuela's on there, they have access to a lot of oil reserves, and they agree to put a certain amount of oil into the market to make money. They don't want to put too much oil in the market or else the price would go down, and they don't want to put too little in the market because the market has certain demands to it, and they want to keep people buying oil. So they control the supply of oil is what OPEC does, and they make sure that all these nations get access to the profits of oil. So that's how OPEC functions. It's very much like a trust. Other things you should know about in the Middle East, Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini believed that the Westerners had taken too much power. We'll talk about how the Western governments took a lot of power in Latin America, and there were some revolutions there, and same thing with Ayatollah Khomeini. He believes that the Westerners need to get out of the Middle East, specifically Iran, and so he creates a very anti-Western regime, a very pro-Islam regime, very back to the fundamentals, and creates a system based on Sharia law. It's a very strict regime and a very Islamic regime. Another person you should know about would be in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is somebody who we fought against in the Persian Gulf War. We allowed him to stay in power, though, because he agreed to certain reforms and demands and the selling of oil, primarily. And so Saddam Hussein was somebody who came back after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and we blamed Saddam Hussein. We believed that he had weapons of mass destruction, and we went in. We did not like some of the things he did. The human rights violations that he had committed were atrocious, having children walk in clear minefields, for example. The cleansing of the Kurds, ethnic cleansing, is an awful and ugly thing, to allow to happen and to lead. And so we came in and we took him out. We brought him home, executed him, and so Saddam Hussein is something that is a regime that you should be familiar with over in Iraq. I would hope that, and you should know who that guy over there on the left is. That would be, of course, say it with me, that would be Osama bin Laden, and that's where 0:30, the movie, came in. Osama bin Laden is the man responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It's something you should know, okay? And we should know a little bit of background on where the Taliban comes from, because I think it's something widely contested in history. But the USSR had actually tried to take over Afghanistan, not to say that Osama is from there, but to say that he has a lot of followers there. And the USSR tried to spread communism. So, you know how proxy wars work. The US arms and trains the Mujahideen, which are a guerrilla fighting group, to try to kick out the Soviets. And they did. They kicked them out. But the problem is that once the Mujahideen was successful, they didn't really want the Americans to stay, and the Taliban, takes this opportunity as a power vacuum and takes over and really starts to recruit, and it's a lot of anti-American, anti-Western groups that coalesce together, and Osama bin Laden believes that he needs to strike the United States, and so he orchestrates the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the interesting connections with Osama bin Laden are that he is from Saudi Arabia, an ally of America, and that bin Laden founded the terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, which you've most likely heard of before, and those terrorist attacks, he is responsible. You should know that as an American, okay? So check out 0:30 to see the greatest manhunt in history. Other places that we need to go. Africa. You should know that in Africa, there was a movement for self-determination, going back to Woodrow Wilson, that Africa should have its own nations. And Kwame Nkrumah, pictured there in Ghana, is going to lead that movement. He's going to say that the sharp ethnic divisions that were created by imperialism need to be smashed and destroyed, and that we need to have a strong African nation. He even believed in Pan-Africanism, a community-based socialist idea of governing, which basically said Africa should be one big nation, and we should all help each other towards a common goal. Very radical, I know. And he creates the Organization of African Unity to get this thing accomplished. And so in Africa, there is a movement, and it's a positive one, in which Ghana is going to create a nation for African people something of a success story. But that is only one. For every Nelson Mandela and Kwame Nkrumah, there are also some dictators. And those power vacuums that we talked about, I'll give you specific names and examples. And an example would be Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who basically takes all of the wealth of his people and has his people living in destitution and poverty, and that is the dictatorship that he creates and runs his country through. In Nigeria, there are some ethnic divisions. Remember, that's what happens when you leave, is those divisions that were created under imperialism just sort of exacerbate and increase. And so you see in Nigeria a similar situation to what happened in Rwanda with the civil wars. And if you're ever interested, Beast of No Nation is a film that talks about the child soldiers of Africa, how they've been mobilized and how they've been used. It becomes like the Isengoran of Africa. If you don't know what those are, then you must go back to the World War II lecture. Please do. So, and watch Beast of No Nation if your sick and heart can handle it. It is a brutal film, but one that I almost think needs to be seen in order to understand how those power vacuums affect every average, people. All right, Latin America. Last time we talked about Latin America, we had talked about the guy in the bottom there, the Black George Washington, Toussaint Louverture, the former slave who took back Haiti, and while he didn't see his revolution through, he certainly led the way for leaders like Dessalines to take power and to try to take back Haiti. Now, the problem is that American business got tied up in Haiti, and American businesses began to want the best trade that they could, and have the Haitian people work for as least as they could, and own as much property as they could. So there became a situation where this became proxy wars, and we pick sides. And in this case, in Haiti, we pick the sides of the Duvalier family, who is an iron fist dictatorship sort of family that has all of the power and all of the wealth in the country, and the Americans support a group who fixes elections, and we do that because American business is making tons of money over in Haiti. And so this is a real nasty part of American history, not to get too much into America, but that the Haitians are ruled by a family who operates like a strongman. Think like your evil grandpa Sigmund Rhee over there. It's a similar situation where you've got these strongmen who have all the power. In Latin America, you have Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who lead that movement, and the United States continues to embargo the Cubans, who they see as an illegitimate government. This is a really complicated one, and I'm going to go fast, but in Nicaragua, we get involved. There is the Sandinistas, who are communist, and we say we don't want that. We want to help the Contras. The only problem is that the Contras are funding their rebellion by selling cocaine. So that's morally, we don't look good helping, cocaine dealers. So we have to find a way to actually do it. Like, how do we help the Contras? How are we going to get money to them? And so the Senate says, we're not going to give money to the Contras. And they tell the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, you cannot have money to give to the drug-dealing Contras. And so Ronald Reagan orchestrates a deal. It's called the Iran-Contra Affair, where he diverts money to the Contras. What he does is he creates a deal to get back hostages that we had over in Iran. 444 days they had taken our hostages. We pay off Iran. We give them a sum of money to get our hostages back. We pay a ransom. And that ransom money, the president asked for $30 million. Well, he only needed $12 million. So he gives the Iranians the 12 million and keeps the other 18 and gives the 18 million to the Contras anyway, essentially going over the head of Congress and the Senate, which is not the way that really presidents are supposed to work, right? And we call it the Iran-Contra Affair. So we're very heavily involved in Latin America. Over in Asia, you should know something about Kim Jong-un. You should know about his haircut. No, I'm just kidding. But you should know about his propaganda and that he threatens nuclear missiles, and he's got this whole nuclear program over there. He is not a friend of the United States, as much as maybe he will smile and say he is. And Kim Jong-un uses propaganda. He tells his people that Americans live in refugee camps and that we all eat pigeons. So make sure you eat your daily dose of pigeon tonight. Over in China, you should know something about the one-child policy, which is that Chinese population growth had gone out of control, and so the government instituted a one-child policy. You can only have one child, and enforced it heavily. And I don't want to go into how they enforce it, but I think you can put two and two together. So, in the workers, they live in a capitalist economy, but very much a communist political agenda, and so the workers are treated very poorly and don't have access to unions and things like that. So, wrapping up for most of today in Asia is going to be Japan. And you've seen that many a times. In Japan, they were hit by this awful tsunami in 2011, and it was one of the worst disasters since Chernobyl. And if you don't know what Chernobyl is, it's a moment in Ukrainian history where a nuclear reactor is set off, and it destroys the land and surrounding land around it, and leads to radioactive fallout. It's really a nasty time. It's a moment where we see the devastation that can be caused by using nuclear programs and having nuclear energy. Well, the tsunami was like that, only maybe even a little bit worse in terms of devastation, and really hurt Japan. And so we had to go over and really help them rebuild their economy, because they are a technological powerhouse. Think Mitsubishi. South Korea, you should know that the South Koreans and the North Koreans are looking to work towards peace. I wouldn't say that it's forthcoming right this moment, but perhaps we can be a little bit more optimistic as both sides have talked with one another. And then the last thing I want to just make sure that you have an idea about and knowledge of is ISIS. And typically when we talk about ISIS, there are words like Islamic, fundamentalist, or Islamic extremist groups. And I want you to think about it this way. And I hope I'm very clear on this. ISIS is a Islamic organization, much in the same way that the KKK is a Christian organization. What I mean by that is the KKK claimed to be Christian. That's what they said. They said they were Christians, and they were hanging black people and causing fear and burning crosses, and they said they are Christians. Well, the ISIS folk, they are out there killing and raping and pillaging and torturing people and saying that they are Muslims. Now, if you read, in the Christian's Bible or the Muslims' Quran, if you read these books, then you would not get to the conclusions that they are. In fact, when you look at the 5 pillars of Islam, or you look at the 10 Commandments, neither of them, preach violence and hurting each other and lack of toleration and all those kind of things. So they are perverting a religion. They are taking a religion and twisting it to fit their own ends. That does not mean that they are religious. It just means that they are using religion as an excuse to fit their end goals. But I would not consider ISIS to be Muslims, and you should not say that all Muslims are ISIS, because I don't think any true Muslims are ISIS, and I don't think any true Christians are KKK members. So please understand the difference between religion in its purest form and religion as a twisting to fit your own personal ambitions. Those are quite two different things. Okay? So I leave you with a meme. I leave you with a meme that is on the back of your packet that I know you are working on very hard, and make sure that it gets done. Okay? I hope this lecture was beneficial. I know it was long, but it is the end of the year, and I think that we did pretty good. So go back, listen to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Go back, listen to anything that you need to prepare yourself for your Global 2 regions. Good luck. Let's get this thing. Let's make sure that we do great this year. Take care, guys.